Welcome back to another episode of Sabbath School Boot Camp, where my job is to help train Sabbath School teachers and front row students to get the most out of their class. Today, we're going to be looking at Lesson 2 of the Adult Bible Study Guide called A Moment of Destiny, or is it a movement of destiny? That's what Mark Finley, the author of this quarter, calls it on the website. So for you Adventist history nerds out there, A Movement of Destiny was actually the title of Leroy Froome's 1971 book chronicling the history of Seventh-day Adventists. Well, whatever we call this thing, we'd better get going. Let's begin by talking about what we've been doing so far this quarter. You see, last week we talked about Revelation 12 as context for these three angels' messages. This week we're in Revelation 14, but we're talking about the second coming, not the three angels' messages. Now, Revelation 12 dealt with what came before the three angels. Revelation 14 deals with what comes after these three messages. So we've been setting up the context on either side of these messages. Now, this week we're going to be talking more about the need to be ready for the second coming of Jesus. And this is how the lesson itself describes the message this week. Here it is. In these last days of human history, he has sent a special message to the world and to his people designed to meet the need of the hour. He pictures this message as being carried by three angels flying in mid-heaven with their urgent end-time message to all the world. The three angels' messages are Jesus' final message of mercy, a call that leads from trusting in our own righteousness to trusting the righteousness of Jesus to justify us, to sanctify us, and at the end of time, to glorify us. As always, though, we must choose Christ, to surrender to him and to obey him, and the choices we make now will indeed impact the choices we make in the final crisis ahead of us. Thus, now is the time to prepare. Now, I think this passage is a good description of what's going on, not just in this week, but this quarter. This is what we're trying to get at for this entire quarter. But before we jump over to Sunday, I want to say a final word about strategy for your teachers out there who may be watching. Now, keep in mind, this is going to be Easter Sabbath, a day in which we should be commemorating the death and resurrection of Jesus. I know the lesson is about the second coming and judgment, but try and fit your class in with the overall tone of the day. We are celebrating what Christ has done for us, even as we look forward to what he's going to do for us when he returns. This is also a day for people to consider giving their lives over to Jesus. So I would encourage you to be evangelistic in how you teach this lesson. Make it Christ-focused. Whatever it is the lesson says, make it Christ-focused. Now, as I said, the lesson is about getting ready for Jesus' return, so you might save 5 or 10 minutes at the end of your class to talk about how we might get ready for Jesus' return. What do the choices we make today actually prepare us for when it comes to the return of Jesus? And how can we help others prepare for the return of Jesus? One answer is by proclaiming the gospel, which needs to go to the entire world before Jesus comes. Hey, I think we just tied this back in with Easter. We need to tell the Easter story, and more importantly, we need to make sure we're living it. Okay, on to Sunday. We are starting in Matthew 24, an apocalyptic chapter in the gospel where Jesus talks about signs of the times. And the major sign Jesus gives us is in verse 14, which says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." Now, in Revelation 14:6, we read that the first angel proclaims the eternal gospel to all the people of the earth. And as the lesson points out, this is the fulfillment of Matthew 24:14. Jesus told us to go into all the world proclaiming the gospel, teaching and baptizing people. And the significance of this word gospel should not be overlooked. John never uses the word gospel in the Gospel of John, nor is it used in the letters of John. This is the only place in the New Testament where John uses the word gospel. And that's very significant. I'm going to have a lot more to say about that next week when we talk about the gospel in more detail. But it's good to note right now how significant this word gospel is here in Revelation chapter 14. We talk about bringing the good news of Jesus to the world. We love to read the Great Commission of Jesus in Matthew 28 at graduations and ordinations and stuff. We need to go into all the world, teach and disciple and baptize. But there's a context to Revelation that adds a degree of urgency to this call. These three angels are the last messages to be proclaimed before Jesus returns. You don't have a lot of time to dance with the gospel, to flirt with the gospel, to entertain the gospel. We need to accept it. And believing what we believe as Seventh-day Adventists as it relates to the second coming, well, we ought to have a greater degree of urgency than we might expect from other Christians. Adventists have historically been some of the most energetic givers and most mission-minded people. We gave and we served because we believed that time was short. And I think we could all agree that we've really stepped back from both of those things in the past 50 years. So, do we believe Jesus is coming soon or not? Now, I would insert into this lesson the challenge from 2 Peter 3:11 and 12, which reads, "Since all these things are to melt away in this manner, what sort of people must you be, conducting your lives in holiness and godliness while waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God?" We should be pursuing Christ-likeness. If Seventh-day Adventists truly believe that the world is going to be destroyed at the coming of Christ, then shouldn't we be the foremost in preaching the gospel? Now, the lesson says, every day by our choices, even in the little things, we are choosing either for or against Jesus. It's not likely that someone constantly making the wrong choices in life will suddenly, in the final crisis, come forward on the side of Jesus, especially when the force of the whole evil world is against them. And I think this makes a great point, and you're probably thinking of an exception to that, which is the thief on the cross. But I think this is a great point, and the little choices we make either lead us toward or away from the bigger choices that we're going to have to make down the road. If you make the little choices each and every day, like to save and invest $1 a day, well, that opens up bigger choices for you down the road when you suddenly have some money to work with. Now, Adventists can sometimes imagine that all choices are big choices, right? If you eat that donut, you are polluting the temple of the Holy Spirit and you will be lost. Okay, well, eating a donut is a little choice. And in the scheme of your life, your health over 90 years, it really isn't likely to mean anything. But I think we are right to notice how little choices tend to stack on top of each other and become big choices over time. We should take our choices seriously, but not be legalistic about every little choice. Don't worry about standing before Martin Luther before the Diet of Worms. Make little choices for Jesus each and every day. All right, let's move on over to Monday. We're going to be focusing on Revelation 14:14 here. And once again, the lesson shows us a statement from the Gospels and how it is being depicted as fulfilled in Revelation. It's about the second coming. But the lesson emphasizes the title we find in Revelation 14:14. Jesus is called the Son of Man. And this phrase is only used twice in Revelation. It's used once here and once in Revelation 1. It's a super common phrase in the Gospels. As the lesson points out, it's used over 80 times, but not so much in the rest of the New Testament. In fact, it's only found 4 other times in the New Testament. Now, this title for Jesus is really heartwarming when we are talking about the second coming. Jesus is not coming as an alien invader, but as one of us. The lesson asks us why John uses this title for Jesus, and honestly, I don't know, and neither do you. But of the 4 gospel writers, John uses this title the least, and there's a lot of scholarly discussion over what exactly this phrase means and where it came from, but I do think the lesson is right to point out that this is one of Jesus's favorite titles for himself, and that it does seem to emphasize his humanity, his identification with us as human beings. This is so important because we often see the divine Jesus in Revelation, the judge or the reaper or the warrior who has come to defeat his enemies. Those are all Jesus too, but what we're seeing is that even after he went to heaven and sat on his throne as God once again, he has not lost his humanity. He is still one of us. So when we meet Jesus in the book of Revelation, we have to keep in mind that he is fully man and fully God. The lesson asks us to look up 3 texts in Matthew, which point to how Jesus is depicted as coming in glory and dividing the righteous and the wicked and all of that. And this is good news, my friends. But when we see Jesus glorified, it reassures us that the path of humility that we are treading, that we're called to tread on this earth, will also lead us to glory. We shall someday be like him if we follow in his footsteps. This is the source of hope for anyone struggling right now, because the way of the cross is not easy, my friends, is it? But if he conquered death, so can we. And if he was welcomed into glory, then so we can be welcomed into glory. Don't overlook the beautiful hope here. And the second question on Monday wants us to look at these three passages in Matthew that talk about the second coming. These verses talk about how everyone is going to see Jesus come, as I said, how there's going to be a judgment when he returns, how he is going to reward everyone according to what they've done. And the second question kind of takes us out of the flow, because Monday is supposed to be a discussion about what it means that Jesus returns as the Son of Man. And the second question and this talk about judgment and reward, it fits better on Tuesday and also on Thursday. So we're going to talk about that over there. Let's move on. Okay, Tuesday begins by inviting us to compare the return of Jesus with his ascension into heaven in Acts chapter 1. There are similarities, of course. Jesus leaves on a white cloud, and he is described as returning on a cloud. And everybody's able to see him in Acts 1, and everybody's able to see him in Revelation 14, it seems. The angel in Acts 1 reassures us that this same Jesus who left will be the one who is returning. And that's good to know, because there are also huge differences between his departure and his return. Jesus didn't leave with a sense of glory with which he is described as returning in Revelation. There's also an element of judgment in Revelation. And this, of course, points us to Daniel chapter 7. Everything points us to Daniel 7, where we have someone described like the Son of Man, don't we? Oh, yes. And this one like the Son of Man in Daniel 7 has long puzzled scholars. Daniel was basically describing a being who looked human, but he wasn't sure if he was human. Today we might have said that we saw someone who looked human. Angels have looked human. Humans have looked human, except Benedict Cumberbatch, who looks like an otter. So how do we know this is Jesus? Well, largely because Jesus used a version of this phrase to describe himself, because what we see happening in Daniel 7 is what we see described elsewhere about Jesus. And we see this in the New Testament. We see the central role the Son plays in the court of heaven. So I think looking back, we can say, this is Jesus. Daniel just didn't know his name yet. All right, so when we read Daniel, we see Jesus more clearly in the book than Daniel did, because he didn't fully understand what he saw. In Daniel 7, we see the Son of Man receiving authority so that everyone who's in the world can worship him. Now, notice in Daniel 7, it says that his kingdom will last forever and that he will have the rightful worship of all the earth. Worship belongs to God alone. And we will see in Revelation chapter 13 that the beasts and the dragon desire the worship of the whole world. That's why the first angel in Revelation calls us to worship God, who is the only one who's worthy of our worship. Now, this is the same Jesus in the Gospels, my friends. He is the one who healed the sick, taught people the Beatitudes. This is an important emphasis in the lesson this week. We shouldn't love one Jesus and be scared of another Jesus. It's all the same Jesus. So when Jesus comes in judgment, it's the Jesus you know and love and are following right now. So what is there to fear? He's still the Jesus you first met in the Gospels. And guess what? He is still for you. He's still the Son of Man. The second question on Tuesday brings this Son of Man topic back up. Why did Daniel call Jesus the Son of Man in something as serious as the judgment? Now, there's a lot I can say about this. And the first thing is to be careful when we read meanings from the New Testament back into the Hebrew Bible. Jesus gives this phrase a messianic meaning, but it's not necessarily clear if Job or Daniel or Ezekiel, who all use this term, meant it in the same way. For instance, Job 25:6 says, "How much less a mortal man who is but a maggot, a son of man who is only a worm?" Is Job calling the Son of Man, that is Jesus, a worm? No, of course not. It's just a phrase that referred to a human being, as I mentioned. When Daniel describes seeing one like a Son of Man, he's saying, as I said, I see someone who looks human. So when Jesus adopts this title for himself, he gave it messianic implications, which we then can read back into Daniel and say, Daniel saw Jesus, okay? Now, I do think that Daniel did see Jesus, don't get me wrong, but the phrase Daniel used, one like a son of man, is just a phrase that a few Hebrew authors use to describe human beings. And I just want to make that clear. Theologically, however, it is shocking that Daniel should see someone who appeared to be human in the heavenly court. Look at these two verses. This is in Daniel 7, verse 13 and 14. I was watching in the night visions, and with the clouds of the sky, one like a son of man was approaching. He went up to the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. To him was given ruling authority, honor, and sovereignty. All peoples, nations, and language groups were serving him. His authority is eternal and will not pass away. His kingdom will not be destroyed. In Daniel, we see this constant rising and falling of kingdoms, culminating in this monstrous beast destroying everything, the fourth beast. Daniel is looking for relief. Is life on earth doomed to be this dire? Man, I think some of us in America need to hear this right now because we're turning into cynics. Everything's corrupt. Everything's lies. Who cares anymore? Well, Daniel cared. Daniel implicitly recognized the value of government. He prayed for Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He prayed that he would be good. The morality of the king was inseparable from the destiny of the kingdom. Now, here we see a judgment scene on these beastly kingdoms, and we might wonder whether any human was fit to rule humanity. Are we all monsters? But Daniel sees one, someone who is obviously good, so good that he can approach God the Father. And God the Father gives him authority, honor, and sovereignty, and a kingdom that will never pass away. Now, that answers the two problems we have so far in Daniel 7. We don't have goodness, and we don't have stability. Kingdoms are rising and falling, but instability is a good thing and the bad thing. Well, why is it a good thing? In Genesis 3, we're told that God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden, lest as sinners they eat from the tree and live forever. God doesn't want evil to be stable. It is better that Hitler has a half-life than that he should live forever. But the instability is also a bad thing because, well, as cities get demolished, new rulers come who suck, rules change, you just can't build a stable life, and that produces anxiety and insecurity. This Son of Man in Daniel 7, however, has a kingdom that will never be taken away. It's stable, but that would be bad if he was just a ruler like all the others. No. This man can approach God, so he must be good. And this turns out to be just what we humans have always needed: a good ruler in a stable kingdom. Now you might wonder, why can't God the Father just rule us? I mean, he's God. He's good and would provide a stable government, to be sure. But don't you want a ruler who understands you, who can relate to you? Goodness, isn't that what these millionaires and billionaires who run for office say? I understand you. I'm one of you. But Jesus truly is one of us. He's experienced the worst of what we've experienced. He is qualified to rule. Jesus taught us to pray for God's kingdom to come. We don't just look forward to the soon return of the King. We are looking for the kingdom, the rule of God here in this place. And if you're tired of how politics is working down here, or not working as the case may be, then pray that prayer. Lord, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. On Wednesday, Jesus is described as having a golden crown on his head when he returns, because he is the king. And as the lesson points out, this is a Stephanos crown, a victor's crown. Now, the lesson contrasts this with the crown of thorns, and that's interesting, I guess, on a metaphorical level. I don't know if that's the right word for it. But of course, when the Romans put a crown of thorns on his head in Matthew 27, this was actually also called the Stephanos crown in Greek. But I think that was used ironically, right? Like, let's give Jesus this crown of victory right before we defeat him. But now Jesus wears a golden Stephanos, not a thorny Stephanos crown. He has earned it. Jesus doesn't wear the crown because King Daddy gave it to him on his 18th birthday. This is no entitled little princeling. He has the scars to prove that he earned his position, that he earned this crown. Now, switching gears to talk about the harvest, there are a number of metaphors or angles from which we can see the second coming. It's a rescue of God's people, it's a judgment of the sheep and the goats, it's punishment of the beasts. But Revelation 14:15 points out that it's also a harvest. The lesson points us towards Mark 4, where Jesus tells a parable of a person planting seed and harvesting it when it's ready. It's the most natural thing to do, right? So there's a sense that Jesus returns when the world is ready for him. You could also go to Matthew 13, find another parable where Jesus says an enemy planted weeds in the field, but that the master waits until both the weed and the wheat grow up to maturity. The New English translation points out that this Greek word for weed probably refers to darnel, a weed that looks really close to wheat. You can Google it and see pictures for yourself, or just look at these. And while Jesus doesn't say the master planted wheat specifically, it's likely that his hearers knew the trouble of telling the difference between darnel and wheat in the early stages. Now, once they're full grown, it's perfectly clear which is which. Which is which. Because, well, I should say which is wheat. Because once the wheat is grown, it's a golden brown color while darnel is black. So it's only in the early stages that it's sometimes difficult to tell which is which. Now, there's an interesting discussion to be had about this metaphor, to be sure. There's a sense in which humanity is maturing over the centuries, and the gap between the true and the false is growing wider and wider and wider. God only knows when the harvest is ready. It's not for you and I to determine, but it sure feels like we're getting close, doesn't it? But I'm drifting from Mark's parable. I like the Ellen White quote here from Christ's Object Lessons. At every stage of development, our life may be perfect. Yet if God's purpose for us is fulfilled, there will be continual advancement. Sanctification is the work of a lifetime. Be perfect at whatever stage of life you're in. What matters is that you just keep growing. Let's head on over to Thursday. Okay, we're going to be talking about grapes and grain. The lesson says in Revelation 14, there are two harvests. The harvest of golden grain represents the righteous, and the harvest of gory grapes represents the unrighteous or the lost. And that is well put, except there's no record of any golden grain being harvested in Revelation 14. There do seem to be two harvests in this chapter, one of which is clearly the gathering and destroying of the wicked. They are compared to grapes, which are gathered and thrown into the winepress of the wrath of God to be stomped until blood pours out of the winepress. It spreads for about 200 miles in every direction, about 5 feet deep. So I guess we're celebrating communion this Sabbath. It's a gruesome picture, and the lesson completely ignores it. This act of harvesting is also called ingathering, which may explain why very few Adventist churches still do ingathering. But it isn't the violence that makes this passage so strange. It's the level of detail. We're told nothing about the harvest of the righteous. We aren't even told specifically that it was a harvest of the righteous. It's so non-specific. But the second harvest is really specific. We know how deep their blood flows and for how many miles. And what's more, this scene clearly conflates the second coming of Jesus with the final destruction of the wicked, which happens 1,000 years later. The text clearly says that this harvest takes place outside the city, which I think means the New Jerusalem, which we see coming down out of heaven in Revelation chapter 20. And we have to keep in mind that this is all metaphorical and symbolic language. The final judgment is like a harvest of grapes. This isn't a detailed description of how things are going to go down. This winepress imagery is borrowed from Isaiah 63, 1-6, which many interpreters see as a passage about the Messiah. So this imagery of Jesus treading the grapes in Revelation 14 and in Revelation 19 is to show that Jesus is fulfilling this prophecy. The prophecy in Isaiah is about victory over God's enemies who have persecuted God's people. Revelation 13, we see another global persecution of God's people, and we see another response to this persecution where God says, yes, I'm going to defeat your enemies. And if the beasts kill their enemies, God will kill his enemies more thoroughly. And if the beasts in Revelation 13 want worship, God will call the whole world to worship him. God will not be outdone. Everything he does is a response to the false and violent behavior of the beasts and the dragon. And this whole treading of the grapes image is a bit of holy exaggeration that ancient kings used to establish their rule. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal called himself king of the world, which the emperors of the Zhou dynasty in China might have debated with him. So while the imagery is violent, we cannot lose sight of the point here that Jesus utterly and completely triumphs over the beast powers that persecute his people. Beating them is as easy as stepping on grapes. Despite the fact that Revelation 13 describes them as acting like they are all powerful, they're just a weed in this world. Now, this description of the second coming in Revelation 14 is propaganda value. It's designed to reassure God's people who feel the pressure of living under the beast and feel tempted to go along with them. And I think the description of the second coming in the last 6 verses of Revelation 14 could also be tied to the first 5 verses of Revelation 14, which describe the redeemed at peace in heaven. Those first 5 verses show the reward of the righteous who stayed faithful to God during the beastly persecution. Then we have the 3 angels' messages in the middle. Finally, we have these last 6 verses showing the penalty of following the beast and the dragon. Okay, time to deal with Friday. Let's wrap all of this up. What can we take away from this lesson? Well, the purpose of the 3 angels' messages, which I remind you we haven't even talked about yet, are to call the world to be faithful to God, their true creator and redeemer. He is going to return, and we see clearly the result of that return. Some are rewarded for their faithfulness, and some are punished for worshiping the dragon. In the end, it's an issue of whom will you worship? The beasts get to make a big play, bringing powerful pressure on people to cave in and worship the dragon, but those who wait on the Lord will be richly rewarded. So the lesson encourages us to be faithful until the end. And not only that, we should encourage each other to remain faithful to the end by bringing the gospel to the world. The judgment is about justice. When God punishes people, it's not a kind of moral tax on them for being bad. It's not gratuitous, even if some of the descriptions seem offensively violent. We have to keep in mind, of course, that the origins of these descriptions are from the Old Testament tradition of royal exaggeration for propaganda purposes. God gives to each person as they deserve. You don't eat weeds, you burn them, so don't be a weed. And you are told all of this beforehand because we have the ability to choose how we want to stand before God in the judgment. It's really a choice between the beasts and Jesus, referred to as the Son of Man. Man or beast. It's someone who understands what you've gone through and loves you anyway, or it's an unfeeling monster who only knows destruction. The beast is a cheap knockoff of God. He wants God's worship, God's power, without God's character. That's the choice we face. So let's encourage our classmates to make the choice for God, not in the last days, but today. All right? Hope you guys have a wonderful class. Thanks for watching Sabbath School Boot Camp. We'll see you next week.